Charlotte Bronte is writing quite a bit about the unfairness or the double standard between men and women that was acceptable in the society in which she lived. So, for example, when Arthur Huntingdon flirts shamelessly with Annabella to the point that it's upsetting to everybody in the room, not just Helen, but mostly Helen, he thinks that's fine. And later he makes light of her pain and mockingly gets down on one knee and says, "Please forgive me." To which she replies, "You're not taking me seriously," kind of, so to speak, and continues in her anger. Then he says, "Okay, okay, I'm sorry." And he does sincerely ask for forgiveness. And she says, "Yes, I do." And then she says, "But how would you like it if I flirted, or if a man flirted with me in front of you?" He says, "I'd blow his brains out." And she says, "But that's not fair. It should be the same for both of us." And he quotes Shakespeare from the play Twelfth Night, in which the character Orsino speech to Viola. So he says, "The cases are different. It's a woman's nature to be constant in love, to love one and only one, blindly, tenderly, and forever." Then further on, quoting, he says, "As Shakespeare has said, however we do praise ourselves, our fancies are more giddy and unfirm, more longing, wavering, sooner lost and won than women's are." So he thinks, okay, well, this is provable. The other thing I thought was kind of funny was the way he refers to his baby boy. First of all, calling him pretty awful names like idiot and stupid. And he also claims that the baby cannot love his father or mother. But back in those days, a baby was referred to as it. So if you listen back, it's always "it can't love, it is crying, and it's a funny way to talk. We don't speak that way nowadays. And yes, they're parents now, as we find out in chapter 28. Now we're beginning chapter 29, The Neighbour, which takes place 1 year later, December 25th, 1823. Another year is gone. My little Arthur lives and thrives. He is healthy, but not robust, full of gentle playfulness and vivacity, already affectionate and susceptible of passions and emotions. It will be long ere he can find words to express. He has won his father's heart at last, and now my constant terror is lest he should be ruined by that father's thoughtless indulgence. But I must beware of my own weakness too, for I never knew till now how strong are parents' temptations to spoil an only child. I have need of consolation in my son, for to this silent paper I may confess it. I have but little in my husband. I love him still, and he loves me in his own way, but oh, how different from the love I could have given, and once had hoped to receive. How little real sympathy there exists between us. How many of my thoughts and feelings are gloomily cloistered within my own mind. How much of my higher and better self indeed unmarried, doomed either to harden and sour in the sunless shade of solitude, or to quite degenerate and fall away for lack of nutriment in this unwholesome soil. But I repeat, I have no right to complain. Only let me state the truth, some of the truth at least, and see hereafter if any darker truth will blot these pages. We have now been 2 full years united. The romance of our attachment must be worn away. Surely I have now got down to the lowest gradation in Arthur's affection, and discovered all the evils of his nature. If there be any further change, it must be for the better, as we have become still more accustomed to each other. Surely we shall find no lower depth than this, and if so, I can bear it well, as well at least as I have borne it hitherto. Arthur is not what is commonly called a bad man. He has many good qualities, but he is a man without self-restraint or lofty aspirations, a lover of pleasure, given up to animal enjoyments. He is not a bad husband, but his notions of matrimonial duties and comforts are not my notions. Judging from appearances, his idea of a wife is a thing to love one devotedly and to stay at home, to wait upon her husband and amuse him and minister to his comfort in every possible way while he chooses to stay with her, and when he is absent to attend to his interests, domestic and otherwise, and patiently wait his return, no matter how he may be occupied in the meantime. Early in spring he announced his intention of going to London. His affairs there demanded his attendance, he said, and he could refuse it no longer. He expressed his regret at having to leave me, but hoped I would amuse myself with the baby till he returned. But why leave me? I said. I can go with you. I can be ready at any time. You would not take that child to town? Yes, why not? The thing was absurd. The air of the town would be certain to disagree with him, and with me as a nurse, the late hours and London habits would not suit me under such circumstances, and altogether he assured me that it would be excessively troublesome, injurious, and unsafe. I overruled his objections as well as I could, for I trembled at the thought of his going alone, and would sacrifice almost anything for myself, much even for my child, to prevent it. But at length he told me plainly and somewhat testily that he could not do with me, and he was worn out with the baby's restless nights, and must have some repose. I proposed separate apartments, but that would not do. The truth is, Arthur, I said at last, you are weary of my company, and determined not to have me with you. You might as well have said so at once. He denied it. But I immediately left the room and flew into the nursery to hide my feelings, for I could not soothe them there. I was too much hurt to express any further dissatisfaction with his plans, or at all to refer to the subject again, except for the necessary arrangements concerning his departure, and the conduct of affairs during his absence, till the day before he went, when I earnestly exhorted him to take care of himself and keep out of the way of temptation. He laughed at my anxiety, but assured me there was no cause for it, and promised to attend to my advice. I suppose it is no use asking you to fix a day for your return, said I. Why, no, I hardly can under the circumstances, but be assured, love, I shall not be long away. I don't wish to keep you a prisoner at home, I replied. I should not grumble at your staying whole months away, if you can be happy so long without me, provided I knew you were safe. But I don't like the idea of your being there, among your friends, as you call them. Pooh, pooh, you silly girl. Do you think I can't take care of myself? You didn't last time, but this time, Arthur, I added earnestly, show me that you can, and teach me that I need not fear to trust you. He promised fair, but in such a manner as we seek to soothe a child. And did he keep his promise? No, and henceforth I can never trust his word. Bitter, bitter confession. Tears blind me while I write. It was early in March that he went, and he did not return till July. This time he did not trouble himself to make excuses as before, and his letters were less frequent and shorter and less affectionate, especially after the first few weeks. They came slower, and more terse and careless every time. But still, when I omitted writing, he complained at my neglect. When I wrote sternly and coldly, as I confess I frequently did, at the last, he blamed my harshness, and said it was enough to scare him from his home. When I tried mild persuasion, he was a little more gentle in his replies, and promised to return. But I had learnt at last to disregard his promises. Those were 4 miserable months, alternating between intense anxiety, despair, and indignation, pity for him and pity for myself. And yet, through all, I was not wholly comfortless. I had my darling, sinless, inoffensive little one to console me. But even this consolation was embittered by the constantly recurring thought, how shall I teach him hereafter to respect his father and yet to avoid his example? But I remembered that I had brought all these afflictions in a manner wilfully upon myself, and I determined to bear them without a murmur. At the same time, I resolved not to give myself up to misery for the transgressions of another, and endeavored to divert myself as much as I could. And besides, the companionship of my child and my dear, faithful Rachel, who evidently guessed my sorrows and felt for them, though she was too discreet to allude to them. I had my books and pencil, my domestic affairs, and the welfare and comfort of Arthur's poor tenants and labourers to attend to, and I sometimes sought and obtained amusement in the company of my young friend Esther Hargrave. Occasionally I rode over to see her, and once or twice I had her to spend the day with me at the manor. Mrs. Hargrave did not visit London that season, having no daughter to marry. She thought it as well to stay at home and economize, and, for a wonder, Walter came down to join her in the beginning of June and stayed till the close of August. The first time I saw him was on a sweet warm evening when I was sauntering in the park with little Arthur and Rachel, who is the head nurse and a lady's maid in one. For, with my secluded life and tolerably active habits, I require but little attendance, and as she had nursed me and coveted to nurse my child, and was moreover so very trustworthy, I preferred committing the important charge to her with a young nursery maid under her directions to engaging anyone else. Besides, it saves money, and since I have made acquaintance with Arthur's affair, I have learnt to regard that as no trifling recommendation, for by my own desire, nearly the whole of the income of my fortune is devoted for years to come to the paying off of his debts, and the money he contrives to squander away in London is incomprehensible. But to return to Mr. Hargrave, I was standing with Rachel beside the water, amusing the laughing baby in her arms, with a twig of willow laden with golden catkins, when, greatly to my surprise, he entered the park, mounted on his costly black hunter, and crossed over the grass to meet me. He saluted me with a very fine compliment, delicately worded and modestly delivered withal, which he had doubtless concocted as he rode along. He told me that he had brought a message from his mother, who, as he was riding that way, had desired him to call at the manor and beg the pleasure of my company to a friendly family dinner tomorrow. "There is no one to meet but ourselves," said he, "but Esther is very anxious to see you, and my mother fears you will feel solitary in this great house so much alone, and wishes she could persuade you to give her the pleasure of your company more frequently, and make yourself at home in our most humble dwelling, till Mr. Huntingdon's return shall render this a little more conducive to your comfort." "She is very kind," I answered, "but I am not alone, you see, and those whose time is fully occupied seldom complain of solitude." "Will you not come tomorrow, then? She will be sadly disappointed if you refuse." I did not relish being thus compassionated for my loneliness, but however I promised to come. "What a sweet evening this is," observed he, looking round upon the sunny park with its imposing swell and slope, its placid water, and majestic clumps of trees. "And what a paradise you live in!" "It is a lovely evening," answered I, and I sighed to think how little I had felt its loveliness, and how little of a paradise sweet Grassdale was to me, how still less to the voluntary exile from its scenes. Whether Mr. Hargrave divined my thoughts I cannot tell, but with a half hesitating, sympathizing seriousness of tone and manner, he asked if I had lately heard from Mr. Huntingdon. "Not lately," I replied. "I thought not," he muttered, as if to himself, looking thoughtfully on the ground. "Are you not lately returned from London?" I asked. "Only yesterday." "And did you see him there?" "Yes, I saw him." "Was he well?" "Yes, that's it," said he, with increasing hesitation and an appearance of suppressed indignation. "He was as well as he deserved to be, but under circumstances I should have deemed incredible for a man to be favored so as he is." He here looked up and pointed the sentence with a serious bow to me. I suppose my face was crimson. "Pardon me, Mrs. Huntingdon," he confessed, "but I cannot suppress my indignation when I behold such infatuated blindness and perversion of taste. But perhaps you are not aware—" He paused. "I am aware of nothing, sir, except that he delays his coming longer than I expected, and if at present he prefers the society of his friends to that of his wife, and the dissipations of the town to the quiet of country life, I suppose I have those friends to thank for it. Their tastes and occupations are similar to his, and I don't see why his conduct should awaken either their indignation or surprise. "You wrong me cruelly," answered he. "I have shared but little of Mr. Huntingdon's society for the last few weeks, and as for his tastes and occupations, they are quite beyond me, lonely wanderer as I am. Where I have but sipped and tasted, he drains the cup to the dregs, and if ever for the moment I have sought to drown the voice of reflection in madness and folly, or if I have wasted too much of my time and talents among restless and dissipated companions, God knows I would gladly renounce them entirely and forever if I had but half the blessings that man so thanklessly casts behind his back, but half the inducements to virtue and domestic orderly habits that he despises, but such a home and such a partner to share it. It is infamous," he muttered between his teeth. "And don't think, Mrs. Huntingdon," he added aloud, "that I should be guilty of inciting him to persevere in his present pursuits. On the contrary, I have remonstrated with him again and again. I have frequently expressed my surprise at his conduct, and reminded him of his duties and his privileges, but to no purpose. He only— Enough, Mr. Hargrave! You ought to be aware that whatever my husband's faults may be, it can only aggravate the evil for me to hear them from a stranger's lips." "Am I then a stranger?" he said in a sorrowful tone. "I am your nearest neighbor, your son's godfather, and your husband's friend. May I not be yours also?" "Intimate acquaintance must precede real friendship. I know but little of you, Mr. Hargrave, except from report." "Have you forgotten the 6 or 7 weeks I spent under your roof last autumn?" "I have not forgotten them, and I know enough of you, Mrs. Huntingdon, to think that your husband is the most enviable man in the world, and I should be the next, if you would deem me worthy of your friendship. If you knew more of me, you would not think it, or if you did, you would not say it, and expect me to be flattered by the compliment." I stepped backwards as I spoke, and he saw that I wished the conversation to end, and immediately taking the hint, he gravely bowed, wished me good evening, and turned his horse toward the road. He appeared grieved and hurt at my unkind reception of his sympathizing overtures. I was not sure that I had done right in speaking so harshly to him, but at the time I felt irritated, almost insulted by his conduct. It seemed as if he was presuming upon the absence and neglect of my husband, and insinuating even more than truth against him. Rachel had moved on, during our conversation, to some yards' distance. He rode up toward her, and asked to see the child. He took it carefully into his arms, looked upon it with almost paternal smile, and I heard him say as I approached, "And this too he has forsaken." Then he tenderly kissed it and restored it to the grateful nurse. "Are you fond of children, Mr. Hargrave?" said I, a little softened toward him. "Not in general," he replied, "but that is such a sweet child, and so like its mother," he added in a lower tone. "You are mistaken there. It is its father it resembles." "Am I not right, nurse?" said he, appealing to Rachel. "I think, sir, there's a bit of both," she replied. He departed, and Rachel pronounced him a very nice gentleman. I still had my doubts on the subject. When I met him on the morrow, under his own roof, he did not offend me any more with his virtuous indignation against Arthur, or unwelcome sympathy for me, and indeed, when his mother began in guarded terms to intimate her sorrow and surprise at my husband's conduct, he, perceiving my annoyance, instantly came to the rescue and delicately turned the conversation, at the same time warning her, by a sidelong glance, not to recur to the subject again. He seemed bent upon doing the honors of his house in the most unexceptional manner, and exerting all his power for the entertainment of his guests, and the display of his own qualifications as a host, a gentleman, and a companion, and actually succeeded in making himself very agreeable, only that he was too polite. "And yet, Mr. Hargrave, I don't much like you. There's a certain want of openness about you that does not take my fancy, and a lurking selfishness at the bottom of all your fine qualities that I do not intend to lose sight of. No, For instead of combating my slight prejudice against you as uncharitable, I mean to cherish it until I am convinced that I have no reason to distrust this kind, insinuating friendship you are so anxious to push upon me. In the course of the following 6 days, I met him several times, but always, save once, in the company with his mother or his sister, or both. When I called on them, he always happened to be at home, and when they called on me, it was always he that drove them over in the phaeton. His mother, evidently, was quite delighted with his dutiful attentions and newly acquired domestic habits. The time that I met him alone was on a bright but not oppressively hot day in the beginning of July. I had taken little Arthur into the wood that skirts the park, and there seated him on the moss-cushioned roots of an old oak tree, and having gathered a handful of bluebells and wild roses, I was kneeling before him and presenting them one by one to the grasp of his tiny fingers, enjoying the heavenly beauty of the flowers through the medium of his smiling eyes, forgetting for the moment all my cares, laughing at his gleeful laughter, and delighting myself with his delight. When a shadow suddenly eclipsed the little space of sunshine on the grass before us, and looking up, I beheld Walter Hargraves standing and gazing upon us. "Excuse me, Mrs. Huntingdon," said he, "but I was spellbound. I had neither the power to come forward and interrupt you, nor to withdraw from the contemplation of such a scene. How vigorous my little godson grows, and how merry he is this morning!" He approached the child and stooped to take his hand, but on seeing that his caresses were likely to produce tears and lamentations instead of a reciprocation of friendly demonstrations, he prudently drew back. "What a pleasure and comfort that little creature must be to you, Mrs. Huntingdon," he observed, with a touch of sadness in his intonation as he admiringly contemplated the infant. "It is," replied I, and then I asked after his mother and sister. He politely answered my inquiries, and then returned again to that subject I wished to avoid, though with a degree of timidity that witnessed his fear to offend. "You have not heard from Huntingdon lately?" he said. "Not this week," I replied. "Not these 3 weeks," I might have said. "I had a letter from him this morning. I wish it were such a one as I could show to his lady." He half drew from his waistcoat pocket a letter with Arthur's still beloved hand on the address, scowled at it, and put it back again, adding, "But he tells me he is about to return next week." "He tells me so every time he writes." "Indeed. Well, it is like him. But to me he always avowed it is his intention to stay till the present month." It struck me like a blow, this proof of premeditated transgression and systematic disregard of truth. "It is only of a piece with the rest of his conduct," observed Mr. Hargrave, thoughtfully regarding me, and reading, I suppose, the feelings on my face. "Then he is really coming next week," said I, after a pause. "You may rely upon it, if the assurance can give you any pleasure. And is it possible, Mrs. Huntingdon, that you can rejoice at his return?" he exclaimed, attentively perusing my features again. "Of course, Mr. Hargrave. Is he not my husband?" "Oh, Huntingdon, you know not what you slight," he passionately murmured. I took up my baby, and wishing him a good morning, departed to indulge my thoughts, unscrutinized, within the sanctum of my house. And was I glad? Yes, delighted, though I was angered by Arthur's conduct, and though I felt that he had wronged me, and was determined that he should feel it too. End of chapter 29.